doing, brother? Doing well, doing well. Well, very good evening this evening. Good to see each and every one of you. Glad you're here with us tonight. Joe, that was very good, brother, very good. And I was glad you came back and clarified that about the young men, because that same thing with men, the young men are can be just as guilty as that. But that is such a plague on our society, and it's everywhere you turn, and it's hard to get away from. And I think of Job, when he said, I make a covenant with my eyes. It was Job or Jeremiah. Now I'm already drawing a blank on that one. Made a covenant with his eyes to not look upon that. So, very good lesson. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 2. So if you want to open your Bibles, we're going to be there. All of our students, all of the young people and last leaders are studying Exodus in different ways. Some of them are doing Bible Bowl, and so they're going chapter by chapter and going through those. And we're going to be doing the same thing in here, but we're not going to be forcing you to memorize all the verses and then take a test afterwards so that you can pass Bible Bowl. So that's a good thing about being an adult. We don't have to do those sort of things anymore, and we can eat ice cream before dinner if we want to. So, in Exodus chapter 2, we're going to continue our study, and obviously we're talking about Moses. Exodus is such an important book that we learn so much about. It is the foundation for many things in Christianity. It's hard to say that Exodus is the foundational book for Christianity, because you also have Genesis, and there's things in Leviticus and throughout the entire Old Testament. Romans 15:4, those things that were written before time were written for our learning so that we can understand these things. And all I have to say to somebody why Exodus is important is because of the Lord's Supper. That's where it comes from. That's where God implemented that, instituted that to the Hebrews, and then Jesus brought that over into Christianity, and it has its reasons and purpose, its types and antitypes that go along with that. And so that's why Exodus is so important. In Exodus chapter 2, we have a focus on Moses, and basically the birth of Moses. Moses is a very interesting person whenever you really step back and compare Moses. I want you to think about these things as we read this chapter. You ever look at the speaking of type and antitype of Moses himself. You know, Moses being born the child of a slave. They were slaves. The Hebrews were slaves in Egypt, and yet he winds up being the son of a queen. He was born in a hut, if you will. And I did not advance that. It's automatic ghost or something. There we go. Born in a hut, but then he wound up living in a palace. I don't know what's going on up there, but you got to quit playing with my stuff. He was a shepherd of flocks and then also a leader of armies. He carried the rod of a shepherd, but remember, whenever we get into chapter 4 and forward, whenever he puts that rod down, and it has the power of turning into a serpent, it has the power to part the Red Sea, and so it has that power of the Almighty. He was a fugitive from Pharaoh, but he was also an ambassador of heaven. He dwelt in the desert, but he was educated in the court of Pharaoh. He is giver of the law. God gave the law through Moses, but he was also a forerunner of grace. And then he is the meekest of men, and he is a mighty warrior, as well as he died alone on a mountain in Moab, and then we see him appear with Jesus. I saw this in one of the commentaries, and I just had to share it because I never really did that comparison. And so as you think about Moses, while we're reading this chapter 2, think about some of these things, and we'll highlight some more parts. Let's look at the first section. This chapter can be broken into 2 different sections, and that first one being Moses' first 40 years, the second half being Moses' second 40 years. Does anybody remember how many years Moses lived? 120. So it's kind of interesting. You can divide his life up in 40 years. And so this first 40 years, look here, beginning in chapter 2, verse 1. And a man of the house of Levi went and took as a wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me. So I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of water." So this is the birth of Moses. And, I remember the week or so ago, whenever Oscar was saying we need somebody to teach on Exodus chapter 2, immediately I thought about, well, that's about the birth of Moses, and first 40 years, second 40 years. Man, how am I going to get anything out of this? And then as I got to studying it, there is a lot here, as usually there is in the Bible. And so let's begin. If we look, first of all, the house of Levi. Who is Levi? The priestly tribe. He is one of the sons of Jacob, of Israel. And now, it's interesting that at the time of this, at the time this was written, was Levi the priestly tribe? Not yet, because the law had not been given him. And he hadn't received Leviticus yet, which is about the Levites. And so this is obviously looking back from that perspective. And so the man of the house of Levi went and took a wife, the daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. Now, this is a Levite family. She bore a child, but we know from reading the text, this is not the only child that they had. In fact, if you want to just flip over to chapter 4 real quick. And you're already familiar with this, but chapter 4, verse 14. And this is the first time that we see somebody else mentioned besides his sister. We're there in chapter 2, but here in verse 14, so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is not Aaron the Levite your brother? And I know that he can speak well, and look, he is also coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart." Now, that's our first reference we have of Aaron. But obviously, there's an older sister, because it says that she's standing far off to see what's happening. So turn with me to Numbers chapter 26. Numbers chapter 26, verse 59. The Bible always is the best commentary. And here you can go right to Numbers 26, verse 59, and you get all the information about who these people are. Numbers 26, verse 59. The name of Amram's wife was Jochebed, the daughter of Levi, who was born to Levi in Egypt. And Amram, she bore Aaron and Moses and their sister Miriam. So what's Moses' father's name? Amram. What's his mother's name? Jochebed. All right, that will be on the test later. All right. Amram and Jochebed. Now we know who this young lady is, his sister. Standing afar off, that's Miriam, and of course we see Miriam later on as they get into the wilderness and things like that, and as well as we see Aaron later on. So here she bore a son. So we know that's not her only son. This has been now her third child. And this child, when she saw him, saw he was a beautiful child. It's interesting in the Bible, the words that they pick. A beautiful child. Now that's not indicating that Miriam and Aaron were ugly. It's just saying that Moses was exceptionally beautiful. Now, what do we mean by that? Does it mean that it's beautiful to look at? I don't know any mother that doesn't think their child is beautiful. So what do we mean by that? And obviously, there's something more here. And don't we sometimes say that people are beautiful on the inside? And so the mother probably saw something in this child, and it's obvious because we go on to see what a great man that Moses is just from this right here. You got it. Yeah, where's Aaron the whole? Well, now he had brothers. Well, now we know. The question was, what about Aaron? She hid Moses. Because back up just a little bit, in verse 22 of chapter 1. Verse 22 of chapter 1. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So obviously Miriam is safe. How did Aaron get by? Well, perhaps Aaron is already old enough that he missed that decree. That he's already old enough that they're not going to throw him into the river. But the babies, for certain, that they're going to throw into the river. And so Aaron is obviously older. And so she says, has a 3 months. She hid him for 3 months. You know, and I don't know anything about mothering. So maybe, you know, after that 3 months' time, it's kind of hard to keep that baby quiet. I noticed that Eden, you know, I've gotten to know Eden a little bit from watching her grow. She's definitely talking a lot more and a lot more active. And so, same way with this 3-month-old child. She could no longer hide him, it says. And she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. Woman, are you crazy? You know, we really step back and think about this. Really? You're going to put your child in the water? Especially, you know, I've seen where you can throw children into the water and they'll automatically learn how to swim. Some of them, you got to teach them. Babies can swim. But a 3-year-old or 3-month-old, throwing it right into the water among these reeds and everything along the river's bank there. Now, you think, why? Why did this woman do this? Well, the Bible tells us. Keep your finger here, and let's turn back to Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23. All right, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23 tells us, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. There's the answer. So why would you do that? Why would you put your child in the river like that? Because they were not afraid of the king's command. Go ahead and mark that because we're going to be coming back, but let's now go back to Exodus chapter 2. And so she puts him in, it says, the reeds by the river's bank. And it's interesting how there can be so many commentaries on such a benign thing. And here, I can't tell you how many commentaries had something to say about these reeds along the side of the river. Folks, it doesn't matter. She put him in a spot where she could at least see what's going on. Because verse 4, and the sister stood afar off. And why was she there? To know what would be done to him. Now, what's going to be done to him according to chapter 1, verse 22? If somebody finds him, an Egyptian official finds him, what are they going to do to that child? They're going to throw him in the water, and he's going to die. So she's standing afar off to see. Then look what happens, as we've read, the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, there's been a lot of different commentaries and different historians looking at this, trying to see who this daughter was. And they've actually made a lot of headway in this. And I'm going to go ahead and turn here. If you're looking at, you're talking about the Pharaoh. It said Pharaoh's daughter. This is during the time of Moses' birth. And so they've done a lot of different research, and this is one that I tend to agree with, that during the time of Moses' birth, that would have been Amunhotep, or sometimes it's pronounced Amunhotep, the first, and he's the one who ordered to have the babies killed. Who does that sound like, by the way? Herod. Herod the Great did the same thing. And so it's his daughter, and it's believed that she is Queen Hatshepsut. All right, and that's the only child that he had. And so there's going to be some more things about that we'll say in just a moment. But Josephus calls her Thermutsis, and then others call her, Eusebius calls her Maris. But a lot of different people believe that it is Queen Hatshepsut. And there's a picture or a photo of her sarcophagus, her funeral what do you call that? Funeral decoration there. And so the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. Now, obviously, this is a place that she must be accustomed to coming to wash herself. She has these maidens with her, and you think it's possible that Jochebed knew that? Absolutely. And when she opened, she saw it, she saw the basket, and she opened it up. Behold, the baby wept. The baby cries. Now, I don't know any woman that's ever looked at a crying baby by itself and said, I got time for you. What happens? Usually the first thing, just what it says right here, she had compassion on him. You see what God is doing here, he's using the tears of a small baby to touch the heart of who? Pharaoh's daughter. And Pharaoh's the one who ordered the what? The killing. Now, where is Moses? He's in the very waters that were, what's the word, edicted, or they did the edict to kill the babies. It's interesting that Jochebed puts him right where death is, and where was Moses saved? In that water. And so she takes him up out of the water, and she says, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Notice, he's identified right away. She can look, just looking at a baby, immediately she can identify. Listen, after living in Paraguay, I can tell you the difference between a Guarani baby and an Argentine baby. They look different. The Latinos there. There's Latino, but there is a difference. And this woman could easily tell this was a child of the Hebrews. And so it's interesting that it says, she said, here comes Miriam now. It says, shall I get somebody to nurse him for you? Well, how did that come about? Well, some of that comes about from history and also things like other Jewish writings. Like this is the Talmud. This is actually from 1889. And it has all this extra information about the story. Now, none of this can be perfectly verified or anything, but it's talking about the names and things like that of Moses. And one of the things it says is that the daughter, the daughter of Pharaoh, tried to get other Egyptian women to breastfeed the baby, and he wouldn't take. And so then comes Miriam and says, would you like me to get one of the Hebrew women? So now this Hebrew, she goes and gets, she says, yes, go get a Hebrew woman. And then who does she go get? Her own mother, his own mother. And so, and not only does his own mother now save her child, she gets to continue being with the child and get paid for it. How about that? Because she's going to get this, she says, give me your wages. All right, so now, as the child grew, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. He became her son. This probably happened after he was weaned from her. And this is interesting. She says, and I called his name Moses. Now again, the Talmud here has some interesting thing. It says, many were the names given to the infant, thus miraculously preserved. Bathia, according to this, that's Pharaoh's daughter, called him Moses, saying, I've drawn him out of the water. The word mo in Egyptian is water, and usis means rescued from. And so rescued from water. So she says that. His father called him Heber because he was reunited to his family. His mother called him Yekuthiel, for she said, I hoped in God. His sister called him Yared, saying, I went down to the river to watch him. And Aaron his brother called him Abigador, for God had repaired the breach in the house of Jacob. Isn't that interesting? You know how we have nicknames and stuff, and so and my family has nicknames for me. I can imagine, here's Aaron calling his brother a nickname, and his sister, same thing, have all these different names that mean things. So she becomes her child, her son. Do you realize what's happening here? What Pharaoh tried to kill will wind up being the deliverer of Egypt. And that's the story that you need to see here. That after all of that, you're not going to frustrate God's plans, and that He will indeed fulfill His plans. Turn with me real quick to Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7. And you have a little bit more information here about the story of Moses. Beginning in verse 17, Acts chapter 7, verse 17. And when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt, till another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so that they might not live. And at that time Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God. Could that be what's meant by the beautiful child? He was well-pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, was mighty in words and deeds. And when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren. That's where we're going to go next now, back to Exodus chapter 2. So she makes him her son. Moses is now in the palace. And you can imagine, you see all those pictures of these Egyptians and stuff, and he's dressed like an Egyptian and everything. We don't think of Moses that way. We think of Moses as the Charlton Heston guy standing there with the beard and everything. But in this case, he was brought up in Egyptian culture. All right, so verse 11. Beginning of verse 11, now we have the second half of Moses' life. Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting, and he said to the one who did the wrong, Why are you striking your companion? Then he said, Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed that Egyptian? So Moses feared and said, Surely this thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of the matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. He sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, How is it that you've come so soon today? And they said, An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and he also drew water for us and watered the flock. And so he said to his daughters, And where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. Then Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah, his daughter, to Moses. And she bore him a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and then they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. Okay, so the second half of Moses' life, I know I keep flipping back and forth, so keep your finger here again, and we continue back where we were in chapter 7 of Acts. It's here, beginning in verse 23. It says, But when he was 40 years old, that's how we know these ages. When he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And this is where it tells that story again. But there's an important thing that it says in verse 25. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but he did not understand. Now, that's an important point. So going back now, in Exodus chapter 2, we see this grown man. He is now living he's he's a pretty important person. If he's living in the palace, he is the queen's son. And at 40 years old, he decides, you know what, I don't really want this. And he's never forgotten his, what's it called, his brethren. He recognizes them as one of his brethren. And so he sees a guy, an Egyptian, beating him. This is one of his mother's people. And he looks this way, and he looks that way, and doesn't see anybody, and thinks he's going to get away with it, and he kills the Egyptian. What does that make Moses? Moses is a murderer. And we forget about that sometimes. We read over this story sometimes, and going back to what Richard was saying on Sunday, we read over the Bible. And we read that, yeah, we know that stuff. We just read right over it. We don't realize, wait a minute, that's a pretty serious charge. He is a murderer. Is that sin? That is sin. I find it interesting that as you get the 10 Commandments, the first, 5 and 6 are talking about worshiping God and keeping the Sabbath and then honoring the parents. And then the very first one that's mentioned, thou shalt not kill. I wonder if his finger kind of stumbled a little bit whenever he wrote that. Well, God knows about what I did. And so it's interesting also when it says he looked this way and he looked that way. You see, Moses was walking by sight, not by faith. And so he supposed that they would understand, but instead he thought nobody sees him. And then the guy says, what, do you intend to kill? Who made you the king and judge over us? Who made you the prince and judge over us? Now, is Moses actually a prince? Moses is actually a prince because, as I mentioned a minute ago, Amunotep, let's see if I can go back here. Amunotep didn't have any sons. He had a daughter. And so as they go down, as you see right here, you have Thutmose the first and Thutmose the second. And this is a bloodline. Well, if you don't have any children and yet your daughter has a son, quote-unquote son, who's next on the throne? He is indeed a prince. Who made you prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me? You can imagine the hair standing up on the back of his neck in that moment. It's like, whoa, I didn't know anybody saw me. And yet, he does, and then he realizes, now how did they look at Moses? They looked at Moses, he's just a meddler. He's a murderer and a meddler. You're meddling in my business now. What, are you going to kill me too? Just leave me alone. Leave us alone. You already caused enough problems for us. You think some of those people got beat more when they found that dead Egyptian? Absolutely, because who are they going to blame? And so he flees, and he flees to the land of Midian. Now, they believe that that would be Thutmose the second is the one who tries to kill Thutmose the second is trying to kill Moses. There you can see a picture of him there in the bottom left. And then it's going to be his son, who Moses will wind up going back to and finally saying, release my people. I'm going to put this up there so you can kind of see. So that face that you see right there on the bottom right, that's the face of the man who defied God. That's the face of the man who saw those 10 plagues and his own firstborn killed in those plagues. And so it's interesting, and I love history when I see things like that. So continuing now, he goes to Midian. In case some of you are wondering where that is, you're familiar with the Exodus travel route that they took where Mount Sinai is. This is in that peak of the Red Sea there, that little split. And so there's that peninsula, the Sinai Peninsula, but that's even on the other side. So he went beyond that. That's how Moses knew where Mount Sinai was in that area so well, because you spend 40 years somewhere, you get to know a place. Andrew and I, we spent only 7 years in Paraguay, and I had Mike so turned around that he had no which way. He didn't have any idea which way it was up, down, left, right, north, or south, because I was taking all these side roads and back roads and everything. You get to know a place. Well, he gets to know this place, living there 40 years. And then it says in verse 16, the priest of Midian. Now, wait a minute. I thought you said a minute ago that we don't have priests yet. Well, we don't have the Levitical priest system. That does not mean we don't have these men who are reverent to God, who are serving as patriarchal priests, if you will. And so in this case, we know it's Ruel, and if he is a priest, we know that's Ruel is Jethro. Later we read that, and there's commentaries that say no, it's his grandfather or father and things like that. But either way, we see later on in chapter 18 and so forth that he is definitely a believer in God. And so he is this priest of God. Now, there's no reason to think that Moses learned about God from Ruel or Jethro. He already knew about God, but here's another person who believes. And so the shepherds are harassing his daughters. He stands up and helps them. And then they're so excited they go back home. And obviously this must have caused some problems because Ruel's response is, how is it that you've come so soon? So apparently it was always a problem. They'd have to go back and water their sheep again or something. And this time they didn't have a problem because Moses took care of it for them. And they're back at the house early. Notice something what's said in verse 19. And they said what? Who helped them? Wait a minute. Go back to verse 6. And what did the Pharaoh's daughter identify him as? A Hebrew child. Now, isn't that interesting? And so he's identified in chapter 2, verse 6 as a Hebrew. And then you get over here in chapter 2, verse 19, he's identified as an Egyptian. I find that very interesting. And of course, by the end of this chapter, when God realizes, or God hears, I should say, hears the cries of his people, he then identifies Moses as what? The deliverer that's going to bring out his people. And so that's an important point to catch, that this identification. And so he then moves in with this family. Obviously, there's a connection there. And the man gives him his wife. And so he marries Zipporah. And she has a son. And his name is Gershom. Now, what does it say Gershom means? Gershom means? Say it again. I've been a stranger. It says in my version, I've been a stranger in a foreign land. What does that tell you? He's still kind of bitter, still kind of hurt, still kind of missing his people. All right? And we go on, obviously. Is this the only child that Moses has? He has another. Yes, that's right, Glenn. He has two. The other one's Eliezer, and we read about him in chapter 18. All right, so he's obviously reflecting on the pain and everything of being separated from his people. And then it happens that the process that the king of Egypt died. And so the one that was seeking his life dies, and now he can go back. You see a parallel here. You see any kind of a... What's that? Herod dies. So who was it that fled to Egypt? It was Joseph and Mary and Jesus, because Herod was trying to kill the children, so they flee. And then you read in Luke as well as Matthew that he died. They were able to come back. So you see this called type and antitype all through this entire part. All right, so then it says, the king of Egypt died, the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage and cried out. And there's several points that you need to see that God does here. The first one being in verse 24, so God heard their groanings. He remembered his covenant. He looked upon the children, and then he acknowledged them. All of these are all important points because in this case he is going to be focusing, and this is at this point now Moses is going to enter the third 40 years of his life, and he's going to become the deliverer. There's also some other interesting points to pull out, and that is that the women that are mentioned in this one chapter here. You have his mother, Jochebed. You have his sister, Miriam. You have Pharaoh's daughter. And then you have Zipporah. 4 women that are mentioned. Could Moses be who he is without those women in his life? And that's some of the points we need to make sometimes whenever we're studying these things, is how important the Bible itself and God makes women many times. And that's why they're included in his genealogy, and even Jesus' genealogy whenever you get into his genealogy line. Any other questions or anything before we finish? Yes.
In this generation of time, something we don't know very much about, but there was another group of people who followed God as well, other than this particular Jewish sect. That was in order of Melchizedek.
That's right.
We don't know that much about it, but apparently there are other people who recognize God as
That's exactly right. And also don't forget, too, that these people he's living with, these are not total, complete strangers. These are actually his long-lost cousins. Remember, this is Keturah's children. Remember who Keturah is? Abraham's wife. All right, so these are some of the offspring from Keturah, the nomadic sons from Abraham. Any other comments or questions? Okay, I think I heard the bell, and I hope you have a better understanding of chapter 2 now, and we will continue next week. Oscar will be continuing with chapter 3 of Exodus. Thank you so much for your attention.